In the climate-controlled archives of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, beneath layers of protective glass, rests a clay prism roughly the size of a textbook. Its four sides are covered with columns of wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface 4,000 years ago. The catalogue reads AN Nuntine 23.444. Scholars call it the Weld Blundell Prism, but what it contains is far more unsettling than its bureaucratic designation suggests. This object lists every king who ruled ancient Sumer, every reign, every dynasty, every transfer of power from the moment kingship, as the text states, descended from heaven. It claims to be complete, an unbroken chain of authority stretching across millennia, except it isn't complete. There are gaps, not cracks in the clay, not damage from time, but absences in the genealogy itself. Names that should connect one generation to the next, bloodlines that should bridge the greatest catastrophe in Sumerian memory, simply aren't there. The text moves from one king to another as if entire families vanished mid-sentence, as if someone decided certain lineages were too dangerous to remember. Mainstream scholarship calls this scribal error, damaged source material, the natural decay of historical record. And perhaps that's all it is. But when you read the Sumerian texts carefully, when you see how obsessively they documented every other aspect of kingship, every ritual transfer of divine authority, every genealogical detail that legitimized a ruler's claim to the throne, these gaps begin to feel less like accidents and more like surgery. What if the Sumerian king list doesn't just record history? What if it records an editing of history, a deliberate removal of bloodlines that connected certain families to sources of power the later priesthood wanted to control? Before we go further, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment. There's something grounding about knowing we're all scattered across different time zones, examining the same ancient question together in the dark. Now, let's start with what we can verify. The architecture of divine succession. The Sumerian king list is not a neutral document. It was never meant to be. When the scribes of ancient Larsa and Isin pressed their styluses into fresh clay around 1800 BC, they weren't creating an academic exercise. They were constructing legitimacy. They were answering the most dangerous political question any civilization faces: who has the right to rule? In the Mesopotamian worldview, kingship was not a human invention. It was a divine institution, a cosmic principle that existed before cities, before agriculture, before mankind had organized itself into anything recognizable as civilization. The opening line of the king list is explicit about this. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not established in Eridu, not invented there, was there, as if kingship were a physical object, lowered from the realm of the gods into the first city ever built, the cult centre of Enki, god of fresh water and subterranean wisdom. This wasn't propaganda, this was theology rendered as political fact. And if kingship descended from heaven, if it came from the gods themselves, then the bloodlines that carried it were not merely royal, they were sacred conduits. To be of the king's bloodline was to carry divine ME, those untranslatable principles of cosmic order that governed everything from temple rites to the movement of stars. The ME of kingship, specifically, was the most potent and jealously guarded, the authority to speak on behalf of heaven, to mediate between gods and mankind, to ensure the cosmos continued functioning. This is why genealogy mattered so intensely to the Sumerians. A king without proper lineage wasn't just politically weak, he was cosmologically invalid. His reign would bring disorder, floods, famine, the collapse of the boundary between sacred and profane. So the king list doesn't merely name rulers, it establishes an unbroken chain of divine transmission, proving that each king inherited the mandate legitimately from his predecessor all the way back to the moment the gods first granted it. Except the chain is broken. The Weld Blundell prism, our most complete version, was presented to the Ashmolean in 1923 by Herbert Weld Blundell, a British archaeologist and antiquities collector who acquired it during excavations in southern Iraq. The prism itself was likely written in the city of Larsa during the early 2nd millennium BC, though it claims to record events reaching back over 200,000 years. Each of its 4 faces contains 2 columns of cuneiform script in the Sumerian language, careful, deliberate, methodical. The text opens with the antediluvian period, 8 kings who ruled 5 cities before the flood swept over the land. Their reigns are fantastically long. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alaugar, also of Eridu, ruled for 36,000 years. On and on through Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak. The 8th and final antediluvian king, Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, ruled for 18,600 years. Then comes the most famous line in Mesopotamian literature, the flood swept over. And after that line, everything changes. The text resumes, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, a new city, a new dynasty, a new beginning. The first post-flood king, Gore, ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by our standards, but a dramatic reduction from the pre-flood figures. And as the list continues through subsequent dynasties, Uruk, Ur, Awan, Hamazi and so on, the reign lengths gradually decrease further, approaching numbers that begin to overlap with historically verifiable rulers. This declining pattern has led scholars to interpret the king list as a mythological framework, gradually giving way to actual historical memory. The antediluvian kings are purely legendary. The early post-flood kings are semi-legendary, and by the time we reach the 3rd millennium BC, we're dealing with real people whose reigns can be cross-referenced with other archaeological evidence. That interpretation is reasonable, defensible, but it glosses over something crucial. The flood doesn't just divide mythical time from historical time, it divides one bloodline from another. And the king list never explains how the post-flood dynasties inherited the divine mandate. It never tells us who Gore of Kish was, or why he had the right to claim kingship after the world was destroyed. It simply asserts, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven. Notice that phrasing, kingship descended from heaven again, as if the flood had severed the original chain entirely, requiring the gods to re-grant the mandate to a new lineage. The antediluvian bloodline, the families who had carried divine authority for 250,000 years, were gone, erased, and with them the genealogical link that would have explained how kingship transferred from the old world to the new. This is where the architectural logic of the king list begins to crack. If kingship is an unbroken chain, why does the chain break at the most critical moment? If genealogy is the proof of legitimacy, why is there no genealogy connecting pre-flood and post-flood rulers? There is one exception, one text that names a survivor, the Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary Sumerian creation and flood narrative preserved on tablet CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, tells the story of Ziusudra, the king of Shuruppak, who survived the deluge by building a boat on the advice of the god Enki. The tablet is damaged, with only about 1/3 of the original text surviving, but the preserved sections are explicit. Ziusudra is granted eternal life by the gods Anu and Enlil after the flood. He becomes immortal, deified. And yet the Weld Blundell Prism does not list Ziusudra as a king. His father, Ubaratutu, is the final name in the antediluvian section. Ziusudra, the one man who carried the old bloodline through the apocalypse, is absent. Why? The standard explanation is that the king list and the Eridu Genesis represent different literary traditions. One is a king list, the other is a narrative myth. They weren't meant to align perfectly. But that explanation assumes these texts existed in isolation from one another, that the scribes who meticulously compiled the king list were somehow unaware of the most famous flood survivor in their own literature. That strains credibility. These were not separate traditions. They were the same tradition, told from different angles. And in one version, the critical genealogical bridge is omitted. There's another detail worth noticing. The instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature in human history, dating to around 2600 BC, presents itself as the teachings of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, to his son Ziusudra, father to son, the transmission of knowledge across generations. The text is framed as a deathbed testament, a father's final attempt to prepare his son for the responsibilities of kingship and survival. My son, let me give you instructions, you should pay attention. So within Sumerian literature, Ziusudra is not a random figure. He is the son of the last antediluvian king. He is the heir. He is the living link between the world that was and the world that would be, and the king list erases him. What might that mean? One possibility, Ziusudra's bloodline posed a problem. If he survived the flood, if he was granted immortality, if he carried the divine mandate forward, then his descendants would have the strongest possible claim to kingship. They would be the true inheritors, direct, unbroken, genealogically pure. Any other dynasty, no matter how powerful, would be a usurper by comparison, unless you remove him from the record, unless you frame the post-flood world as a fresh start, where kingship descends from heaven anew, unconnected to what came before. Then the old bloodline ceases to matter. Then the new dynasties, Kish, Uruk, Ur, can claim legitimacy without competing with the shadow of the antediluvian kings. This isn't speculation in a vacuum. We know from other Mesopotamian sources that genealogical legitimacy was contested, manipulated, and politically weaponized throughout Sumerian and Babylonian history. Kings regularly commissioned inscriptions tracing their ancestry back to legendary figures to strengthen their claims. Dynasties that couldn't prove direct descent from earlier rulers often claimed divine appointment instead, bypassing genealogy altogether by asserting the gods had chosen them. The third dynasty of Ur, the political context in which many copies of the king list were compiled, provides a particularly clear example. The Ur III rulers, 2112-2004 BC, built an empire that stretched across southern Mesopotamia, and they desperately wanted to legitimize their power by connecting themselves to the glorious past. Yet, we have almost no reliable information about their genealogy. Modern scholars still debate whether the founder of the dynasty, Unamu, was the brother of his predecessor Utuhigul, or merely his general. We don't know with certainty who the wives and mothers of the Ur III kings were. We don't know the father of the final king, Ibisin. For a dynasty obsessed with monumental architecture, administrative precision, and the projection of cosmic order, this genealogical silence is bizarre, unless it's intentional, unless obscuring their ancestry allowed them to avoid uncomfortable questions about legitimacy. And one way to avoid those questions is to normalize genealogical gaps, to make it seem natural that the most important transitions in history lack clear bloodline documentation. The king list, then, may be doing two things at once. On the surface, it presents an unbroken chain of kingship, but beneath that surface, it models a pattern it's acceptable for the chain to break, as long as the gods reauthorize it afterward. The flood becomes a narrative device for resetting legitimacy. And once you've established that precedent, you can apply it elsewhere. New dynasties don't need to prove descent from the old, they just need to claim the gods chose them. Which brings us back to the gaps. The World Blundell Prism is not the only version of the king list. Dozens of fragmentary copies have been found at sites across Mesopotamia, Nippur, Kish, Susa, Lhasa. Some are older than the World Blundell text. Some contain different king names, different reign lengths, different sequences. No two versions are identical. And the differences aren't random. They reflect the political priorities of whoever commissioned them. Each version subtly emphasizes the legitimacy of a particular city or dynasty by positioning it as the rightful heir to the kingship that descended from heaven. What's striking is what they all agree on: the structure. Every version includes the antediluvian kings. Every version includes the flood. Every version restarts the sequence afterward without explaining the genealogical connection. The gaps are consistent. That consistency suggests intention. If the gaps were simply due to lost information, we'd expect different scribes to fill them in differently based on local traditions or educated guesses. But they don't. They preserve the absence. They copy the silence. Why copy silence unless the silence serves a purpose? 1,000 years before the sky fell. Let's talk about the 8 kings, the antediluvians, the rulers whose reigns spanned epochs so vast they feel less like history and more like geology. According to the Weld Blundell prism, these 8 figures ruled 5 cities over a combined total of 241,200 years before the flood. The shortest reign, Ubaratutu's 18,600 years, would still encompass the entire span of recorded human history twice over. The longest, Enmenluana's 43,200 years, stretches beyond comprehension. These numbers don't fit any known framework of human biology, political stability, or civilizational continuity, so mainstream scholarship treats them as mythological. Symbolic. Theological constructions meant to glorify the distant past and emphasize the gods' direct involvement in early kingship. Some researchers have suggested the numbers encode astronomical cycles, precession of the equinoxes, lunar months, planetary alignments. Others propose they represent dynasties rather than individuals, with each king standing in for a sequence of rulers compressed into a single legendary figure. Still others argue the Sumerians used a different mathematical base or time reckoning system that doesn't translate directly into years as we understand them. All plausible theories, all reasonable attempts to reconcile myth with reality, but they all share the same assumption: these kings didn't actually exist. What if we challenge that assumption? Not by claiming they lived for tens of thousands of years, that strains biology beyond breaking, but by asking a different question: why did the Sumerians insist they did? Because insist they did. The king list doesn't frame these figures as allegories or metaphors. It lists them the same way it lists later: historically verifiable rulers. Same format, same grammatical structure, same attention to detail regarding city names and reign lengths. The text draws no distinction between mythical and historical kings. It treats the entire sequence, from Alulim of Eridu to the last kings of Isin, as a single continuous reality. That insistence is worth taking seriously, even if we don't accept the reign lengths literally. The Sumerians were not primitive storytellers projecting fantasies onto clay. They were sophisticated administrators who ran complex irrigation networks, managed temple economies, trained scribal schools, and maintained legal codes. They distinguished between different types of texts, myths, hymns, administrative records, royal inscriptions. They knew the difference between a god and a king, between a legend and a transaction, and they chose to present the antediluvian kings as real. So what might these figures represent? The names themselves offer clues. Alulim, the first king, ruled in Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, the cult centre of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. The second king, Alalgar, also ruled Eridu. Then kingship moved to Bad Tabira, where 3 kings reigned: Enmenluana, Enmengalana, and the divine shepherd Dumuzid. Then to Larak, where Ensipad Zidana ruled. Then to Sippar, where Enmenjurana held power. And finally to Shuruppak, where Ubaratutu became the last king before the flood. Notice the titles. Several of these kings bear the prefix En, which in Sumerian denotes a high priest or lord. Enmenluana, lord whose divine powers are lofty. Enmengalana, lord whose divine powers are great. Ensipadzidana, lord of the righteous scepter. These aren't generic royal epithets. They're religious designations. They describe individuals whose authority derived not just from political power, but from priestly function, mediation between heaven and earth, stewardship of sacred knowledge, custodianship of divine me. In other words, these kings weren't simply rulers. They were priest kings, figures who embodied both temporal authority and cosmic responsibility. And their cities weren't arbitrary political capitals, they were cult centres, sacred sites where specific gods were worshipped and specific cosmic functions were performed. This pattern suggests something important. The antediluvian kings may represent a particular kind of kingship that later Sumerian civilization remembered but no longer practiced. A fusion of political, priestly, and perhaps even shamanic roles that concentrated enormous knowledge and authority in single bloodlines. If the me of kingship, the divine principles governing rulership, were not just legal codes but actual transmitted wisdom, stromical, agricultural, metallurgical, medical, architectural, then these long reigns might encode a different truth. These families preserved knowledge across many human generations. Think of it this way. If a priestly bloodline maintained libraries, trained successors, and passed down observational records from generation to generation, their collective reign over certain domains of knowledge might feel, in cultural memory, like the reign of a single immortal figure. The individual kings died, but the office, the role, the function, the custodianship persisted unbroken. Over centuries or millennia, the distinction between the office and the office holder could blur. The bloodline itself becomes the entity that rules. This interpretation finds indirect support in another peculiar feature of the antediluvian section, the cities. Only 5 cities are listed as seats of kingship before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Archaeological evidence suggests many more settlements existed during the Uruk and Jemdet Nasser periods, roughly 4000–3000 BC. Yet the king list singles out these 5. Why? Because they were cult centres with specialised functions. Eridu, the house of Enki, wisdom and subterranean waters. Bad Tabira, associated with metalworking and craftsmanship. Sippar, solar temple, centre of the sun god Utu. Shuruppak, associated with Ninlil and grain storage, survival knowledge. Each city represented a different sphere of cosmic and practical knowledge, and the priestly families who ruled them were the custodians of those spheres. If this is accurate, the antediluvian period wasn't a time of individual superhumans living impossible lifespans. It was an era when knowledge-keeping bloodlines controlled civilization's most critical functions, and those bloodlines were remembered collectively, compressed into legendary figures whose reigns symbolized the unbroken transmission of their expertise. Then came the flood. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 1673, provides fragmented but vivid details. The gods grow weary of humanity's noise. The council decides to destroy mankind with a deluge, but Enki, who had created humans in the first place, cannot bear to see them completely annihilated. He warns Yasudra, the king of Shuruppak, through the wall of a reed hut, a detail echoed later in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic and the Babylonian flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Ziusudra builds a boat. The storm comes. For 7 days and 7 nights, wind and water obliterate the world. When the sun returns, Ziusudra emerges, offers sacrifice, and is granted eternal life by the gods An and Enlil. The preserved text ends with Ziusudra being taken to Dilmun, the paradisiacal land of immortality. But here's what the Eridu Genesis doesn't say: what happened to everyone else who survived? Because people did survive, obviously. The post-flood sections of the King List document: new dynasties, new cities, new rulers. Sumerian civilization continues. So the flood, whatever historical event or series of events it may encode, was not a complete extinction. It was a catastrophic disruption, a civilizational collapse that severed continuity, destroyed infrastructure, scattered populations, and erased institutional knowledge. except for what Ziusudra carried with him. If Ziusudra was, as the text suggests, the last antediluvian king, the final inheritor of priestly bloodlines stretching back to Eridu and Bad Tabira, then he didn't just save himself and his family. He saved the knowledge, the me of kingship, the wisdom accumulated over unimaginable spans of time. He became, in essence, the single thread connecting the old world to the new, and that made him both invaluable and dangerous. Invaluable because without him, post-flood humanity would have had to rediscover everything from scratch: agriculture, writing, architecture, astronomy, law. Dangerous because his bloodline's claim to kingship would be absolute. If divine mandate passed through genealogy, and his genealogy was the only one that survived the flood intact, then no other family could legitimately claim the throne unless they somehow absorbed, married into, or erased his line. The king list chooses erasure. By omitting Ziusudra from the sequence of kings, the text accomplishes something subtle but profound. It disconnects post-flood kingship from antediluvian bloodlines. It treats the flood as a total reset, requiring the gods to descend kingship from heaven again, as if for the first time. This narrative move allows later dynasties, Kish, Uruk-Ur, to claim legitimacy without reference to the old bloodline. They don't need to prove descent from Ziusudra, they just need to prove the gods chose them. But the erasure isn't perfect. Other texts remember him. The Eridu Genesis names him. The instructions of Shuruppak identifies him as Ubaratutu's son and heir. Later Babylonian sources equate him with Utnapishtim, the immortal flood survivor in the Epic of Gilgamesh. His story is too deeply embedded in Mesopotamian tradition to be completely removed. So instead, the king list sidelines him. It preserves the structure, antediluvian kings, flood, post-flood dynasties, but removes the genealogical link. The architecture remains, but the bloodline is redacted, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Ziusudra's bloodline was deliberately written out of the official king list, what happened to his descendants? Did they fade into obscurity? Did they lose political power, but retain some other form of authority, priestly, scholarly, custodial? Or did later dynasties systematically suppress them, ensuring no rival bloodline could challenge the new order? We can't answer that with certainty, but we can look at the pattern, because Ziusudra isn't the only missing link. As we'll see, the genealogical gaps in Mesopotamian records multiply as we move through history. Bloodlines that should be traceable become murky, royal families that should be documented become anonymous, and always the justification is the same: the gods granted kingship. Divine favour matters more than ancestry, unless ancestry is divine favour inherited rather than bestowed, in which case erasing the bloodline erases the competition. Let's turn now to the post-flood world and ask a more specific question. If the old bloodline was erased, how exactly did the new dynasties establish legitimacy? What mechanisms replaced genealogy as proof of the right to rule? And why, despite the king list's attempt to present an unbroken chain, do the gaps keep appearing? The silence between Shuruppak and Kish, after the flood swept over, after the waters receded and the sun returned, after Ziusudra offered his sacrifices and was taken to Dilmun, after the world rebuilt itself from mud and ruin. The text resumes, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, not Eridu, not Shuruppak, a city that isn't mentioned at all in the antediluvian section, suddenly becomes the seat of the first post-flood dynasty. And its first king, Gor, or Sorur, is introduced without ancestry, without explanation, without any indication of how he acquired the right to claim kingship. He simply appears. According to the Weld Blundell prism, Gor ruled for 1200 years. Still fantastically long, but a dramatic reduction from the antediluvian figures. After him came a succession of kings: Gula, Nidaba, Anapad 960 year, Palakinatim 900 year, and so on through 23 kings spanning a combined 24,510 years. The first dynasty of Kish eventually gave way to the first dynasty of Uruk, which included the legendary Gilgamesh, then to the first dynasty of Ur, and onward through cycles of rise and fall across southern Mesopotamia. But the question remains, who was Gar? Where did he come from? Why Kish? And most importantly, by what authority did he claim kingship when the only surviving bearer of the antediluvian bloodline, Ziusudra, was nowhere to be found in the official record? The text offers no answers. It simply asserts, kingship descended from heaven. Again, this phrasing is crucial. It doesn't say kingship continued after the flood. It doesn't say kingship passed to Kish. It says kingship descended from heaven, using the exact same formulation as the opening line of the king list. It's as if the flood wiped the slate clean, forcing the gods to re-establish the institution of kingship from scratch, granting it to a new city and a new bloodline unconnected to what came before. In theological terms, this makes sense. If the flood was divine judgment, punishment for humanity's transgressions, then the old order, including its royal bloodlines, might be considered tainted. The gods destroy the world and start over with a purified version, selecting new families to carry the mandate. Gar isn't claiming to be Ziusudra's descendant, he's claiming to be the god's fresh choice. But in political terms, this creates a problem. If kingship can be granted arbitrarily by divine favour, then any ruler can claim divine favour and challenge existing dynasties. The very concept of legitimacy becomes unstable. You need some mechanism to distinguish a genuine god, chosen king, from a usurper who simply claims divine backing. Genealogy is one such mechanism. You can verify descent. Divine omens are another. You can point to eclipses, victories in battle, successful harvests, as proof the gods approve. But without clear criteria, legitimacy becomes a matter of force and propaganda. And that's precisely what we see in the post-flood period. The king list itself documents constant turnover. Kish is succeeded by Uruk, then Ur, then Awan, then Kish again, then Hamazi, then Uruk again, then Ur again, on, in cycles that suggest persistent warfare and rival claims to supremacy. No single dynasty holds power for long. The kingship, as the text phrases it, keeps moving from city to city, as if heaven itself can't decide where it belongs. This instability contrasts sharply with the antediluvian period. There, despite the impossibly long reigns, the sequence is orderly. Kingship begins in Eridu, moves to Bad Tabira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak, and each transition is smooth, almost inevitable. The impression is one of cosmic order, a planned unfolding of divine history. But after the flood, order fractures. Kingship becomes contested, precarious, always one defeat away from transferring elsewhere. What changed? One possibility, the antediluvian period, represents an era when a single priestly bloodline or a small network of allied bloodlines controlled knowledge and authority without serious rival. The long reigns weren't individual lifespans, but the duration of that bloodline's uncontested dominance. Then the flood disrupted everything. Institutional knowledge was lost. Infrastructure collapsed. Populations scattered. Multiple families, multiple cities, multiple factions suddenly found themselves competing for power in a world where the old certainties no longer applied. In that context, the absence of Ziusudra from the king list becomes a symptom of a larger fracture. If his bloodline had survived intact and maintained its authority, there would be no need for kingship to descend from heaven again. There would be continuity, not a reset. The fact that the text insists on a reset suggests that continuity was impossible or undesirable. But here's the unsettling detail. The instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest Sumerian literary works, frames itself as the teachings of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, to his son Ziusudra. This text predates the World Blundell Prism by centuries. Early versions have been found at Abu Salabik and Nippur, dating to around 2600 BC. By the time the king list was being compiled, and copied in the early 2nd millennium BC, the Instructions of Shuruppak was already an ancient, venerated work, taught in scribal schools, memorized by students, considered foundational wisdom. So the scribes who compiled the king list knew about Ziusudra. They knew he was Ubaratutu's son. They knew he was positioned as the inheritor of antediluvian wisdom, and they chose not to include him in the king list. That's not an accident. That's editorial policy. Why would they do that? One answer, because including Ziusudra would create a genealogical problem. If Ziusudra survived the flood, if he was granted eternal life, if he carried the antediluvian bloodline forward, then any king who could credibly claim descent from him would have an overwhelming advantage in legitimacy disputes. That claim would trump divine omens, military victories, or economic prosperity. You couldn't argue with it. The blood would speak for itself. But if no post-flood dynasty could actually prove descent from Ziusudra, either because his descendants remained obscure or because they were systematically excluded from power, then acknowledging his survival in the king list would weaken the legitimacy of all post-flood kings. It would leave a permanent question mark hanging over every dynasty. Why aren't you descended from the one bloodline that carried kingship through the apocalypse? So the simplest solution is omission. Frame the flood as a total discontinuity, let kingship descend from heaven twice. Treat the post-flood world as a new dispensation unconnected to the old. Then Gor of Kish doesn't need to explain his ancestry. Gilgamesh of Uruk doesn't need to trace his lineage to Eridu. Messana of Ur doesn't need to justify his claim by reference to antediluvian bloodlines. They're all equally legitimate or equally illegitimate because the old order is gone and the new order rests solely on divine favour as demonstrated by success. But what if Ziusudra's bloodline didn't disappear? What if his descendants persisted in some capacity, not as kings, but as priests, scribes, or custodians of sacred knowledge? What if the tension in Mesopotamian civilization wasn't between dynasties competing for the same throne, but between political kingship and a rival source of authority rooted in genealogical connection to the antediluvian past? That possibility gains weight when we look at another peculiar feature of Sumerian religion, the Me. The Me are difficult to define. They're often translated as divine powers or divine decrees, but that flattens something more complex. In Sumerian cosmology, the Me are the fundamental principles that govern existence. Everything from kingship, priesthood and judgment, to music, sexual intercourse, and lamentation. They're not laws in the abstract sense. They're forces, tangible, transferable, possessible. A city that has the Me of kingship can produce legitimate rulers. A temple that has the Me of priesthood can train effective intermediaries with the gods. A family that possesses certain Me becomes the bloodline through which those principles flow. And critically, the Me can be stolen, transferred, or inherited. The myth of Inanna and Enki, preserved on tablet 15283 from Nippur and other fragments, tells the story of how the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk, and tricks him into giving her over 100 Me, which she then transports to her own city of Uruk. Enki sends demons to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes, bringing the Me to Uruk and permanently elevating its status. The story is often read as a political allegory for Uruk's rise to prominence over Eridu, but at a deeper level it describes Me as transferable containers of power. They don't spontaneously generate, they pass from holder to holder, and whoever holds them has authority. Now apply that logic to bloodlines. If certain Me, specifically the Me of kingship, were originally held by the antediluvian priest kings, and if those Me could only be transferred through lineage, ritual, or divine intervention, then the flood creates a critical problem. When the antediluvian world was destroyed, where did the Me go? If Ziusudra carried them forward, then his bloodline retained the Me of kingship, and anyone who wanted to rule legitimately would need to either marry into that line, receive the me from them ritually, or somehow wrest the me away by force or subterfuge. But if the king list doesn't acknowledge Ziusidra's survival, it can't acknowledge his retention of the me, which means post-flood kings would have to claim the me descended from heaven independently, bypassing the old bloodline entirely. That claim works only if the old bloodline no longer exists, or if it exists but is powerless, sidelined, written out of the official narrative. And that brings us to a troubling pattern. Everywhere we look in Mesopotamian texts, we find families and individuals who possess enormous knowledge or authority but are genealogically obscure. Enki himself, the god of wisdom who warns Ziusudra, is sometimes depicted as an outsider figure, associated with the watery abyss, the Abzu, rather than the heavenly assembly. The scribal schools, the aduba or tablet houses, trained students in reading, writing, mathematics and ritual, but their teachers are rarely identified by family name or lineage. The great sages, the Apkallu, who Babylonian tradition claimed taught humanity before the flood, are described as emerging from the sea, their origins mysterious. It's as if Mesopotamian culture preserved a memory of knowledge bearers whose ancestry was either unknown or deliberately obscured. These figures possess authority, but that authority doesn't flow through the standard channels of kingship or temple hierarchy. It comes from somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere that no longer fits neatly into the post-flood order. Could those knowledge bearers be the remnants of Ziusudra's line, fathers and sons, the testimony of Shuruppak? Before we go further into the genealogical void, we need to examine the one text that explicitly names the father-son relationship spanning the flood, the instructions of Shuruppak. This text is ancient even by Sumerian standards. Copies have been found at Abu Salabik, dating to around 2600 BC, making it one of the earliest known pieces of Sumerian wisdom literature. Later versions from Nippur and show it remained popular for over 1,000 years, taught in scribal schools as foundational ethical and practical guidance. The format is simple. A father, Shuruppak, gives advice to his son Ziusudra, covering everything from property management and marriage to dealing with liars and avoiding violence. My son, let me give you instructions, you should pay attention. Ziudsura, let me speak a word to you, you should pay attention. Do not neglect my instructions. Do not transgress the words I speak. The instructions of an old man are precious. You should comply with them. The text then proceeds through hundreds of lines of proverbs, warnings and counsel. Don't buy a donkey that brays. Don't break into houses. Don't sit alone with a married woman. Don't hire unreliable workers. Listen to your elder brother. Honour your father and mother. Much of it is practical, agricultural, economic, social, but woven through the practical advice is something deeper, the transmission of order. Shuruppak isn't just teaching his son how to farm or trade. He's teaching him how to maintain civilization itself, how to navigate the complexities of human society, how to preserve wisdom in the face of chaos. And the framing is insistent. This is a father speaking to his son. This is bloodline knowledge passed through lineage. Kurupag gave these instructions to his son. Kurupag, the son of Ubaratutu, gave these instructions to his son Ziudsura. That line appears multiple times throughout the text, almost like a refrain, hammering home the genealogical connection. Ubaratutu to Shuruppak to Ziusudra. 3 generations explicitly named. 3 links in a chain that connects the pre-flood world to whatever comes after. And Ubaratutu, as the Sumerian king list confirms, was the 8th and final antediluvian king. He ruled Shuruppak for 18,600 years before the flood swept over. So the instructions of Shuruppak isn't a generic wisdom text. It's the testament of the last antediluvian royal family, delivered at the threshold of apocalypse. That context transforms the entire document. When Shuruppak tells Ziusudra, you should not travel during the night, it can hide both good and evil, he's not offering casual advice. He's preparing his son for a world where danger will be constant, where survival will require vigilance. When he says you should not worry unduly about what leaves the house, he's teaching detachment, the psychological resilience needed to endure catastrophic loss. When he warns fate is a wet bank, it can make one slip, he's acknowledging the precariousness of existence, the ease with which certainty collapses. The entire text reads like a father who knows something terrible is coming and is desperately trying to equip his son to survive it, not just physically, but ethically, socially, spiritually. Because Ziusudra won't just survive the flood, he'll have to rebuild civilization afterward. And the knowledge Shuruppak gives him, the instructions, the me, the accumulated wisdom of 241,200 years of antediluvian kingship, will be the seed from which the new world grows, unless that seed is never planted. Unless Ziusudra survives, but is prevented from re-establishing the bloodline's authority, unless his descendants are systematically excluded, marginalised or forgotten, leaving the instructions of Shuruppak as a relic of a lost world rather than the foundation of a new one. That possibility is borne out by the flood narrative itself. The Eridu Genesis, fragmentary as it is, makes clear that Ziusudra's survival was not an accident. Enki deliberately saved him. The god of wisdom, the patron of Eridu, the deity associated with the Abzu and secret knowledge, intervened to preserve one man and, by extension, one bloodline. Why? The text offers a theological answer. The gods regretted their decision to destroy humanity. After the flood, they realized they had overreacted. Enlil, the god who decreed the deluge, was angry at Enki for subverting the plan. But Enlil eventually relent, granting Ziusudra eternal life and settling him in Dilmun as a reward for his piety and obedience. But there's a political subtext. Enki is consistently portrayed in Sumerian literature as the god who favours humanity, who gives them knowledge, who undermines the harsher decrees of the other gods. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki creates humans in the first place to relieve the lesser gods from labour. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, he gets drunk and gives away the me, distributing divine power more widely. In the Eridu Genesis, he saves humanity from complete extinction by warning Ziusudra. Enki is, in effect, the god of knowledge transmission. He doesn't hoard wisdom, he distributes it. And if Ziusudra is his chosen vessel, the one human being Enki ensures survives with intact knowledge of the antediluvian world, then Ziusudra represents Enki's strategy for preserving civilization against the destructive impulses of the other gods. But here's the critical point. The other gods didn't want humanity completely destroyed, but they did want the old order erased. They wanted a reset, a purified world where humans were more obedient, less noisy, less troublesome. And that reset required breaking the continuity of the antediluvian bloodlines, which had accumulated too much power, too much knowledge, too much autonomy. Ziusudra's survival, then, is a compromise. Enki saves him, preserving the knowledge, but the other gods ensure he cannot restore the old order. He lives, but his bloodline doesn't rule. The kingship descends from heaven again to new families, new cities, a new political structure that keeps power distributed and prevents any single lineage from dominating as the antediluvians had. In this interpretation, the omission of Ziusudra from the king list isn't a scribal error. It's a theological political statement. Yes, he survived. Yes, he carried knowledge forward. But his survival didn't entitle his descendants to kingship. The gods chose differently, and the new dynasties of Kish, Uruk, and Ur represent that new divine choice, unconnected to the old bloodlines. Except the instructions of Shuruppak contradicts that narrative, because If Ziusudra received the wisdom of his father, and if that wisdom was the accumulated knowledge of the antediluvian world, then Ziusudra did inherit something essential, something more important, perhaps, than political kingship. He inherited the me of knowledge preservation, the role of teacher, the function of maintaining continuity across catastrophe. And that role, unlike kingship, doesn't require official acknowledgement. It doesn't need to be listed in royal inscriptions. It operates in the background through scribal schools, priestly families, wisdom literature, oral tradition. It persists precisely by being invisible, unmarked, genealogically obscure. Which brings us to a peculiar historical fact. We don't know who wrote the instructions of Shuruppak. We know it existed by 2600 BC. We know it was copied and taught for over a millennium. But we have no record of its author, its original commissioners, or the community that preserved it. It's attributed to Shuruppak himself, a figure from before the flood, yet somehow it survived into historical Sumer, passed down through generations whose names we don't have. That anonymity mirrors the anonymity of Ziusudra's descendants. If they persisted as knowledge keepers rather than kings, if their authority came from wisdom rather than genealogy, then they might intentionally obscure their bloodline, avoiding the dangers that come with visible power. Better to be scribes than kings. Better to teach in Aduba schools than sit on thrones. Better to preserve the me through cultural transmission than claim them through political force. And if that's what happened, if Ziusudra's line continued as a hidden bloodline of scribes, priests and sages, then the gaps in the king list make perfect sense. They're not erasing powerless nobodies. They're erasing a rival source of authority, one that doesn't compete for kingship openly, but maintains a quiet, persistent claim to authenticity rooted in unbroken connection to the antediluvian past. The dynasty that forgot its name. Let's move forward in time to a period where we should have genealogical clarity but mysteriously don't. The third dynasty of Ur, also called Ur III, which ruled southern Mesopotamia from approximately 2112 to 2004 BC. This was one of the most administratively sophisticated civilizations in human history. The Ur III state left behind tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, economic records, legal documents, temple receipts, grain allotments, livestock counts, labour assignments. The bureaucracy was meticulous. Scribes tracked everything. We know how much barley was distributed to workers on specific dates in specific cities. We know the names of low-level officials managing canal maintenance. We know shipping routes, tax rates, and diplomatic exchanges with distant kingdoms. And yet, bizarrely, we don't know the genealogy of the royal family. The founder of the dynasty, Urnamu, may or may not have been the brother of his predecessor, Utuigol of Uruk. Scholarly consensus is uncertain. One historical inscription suggests they were brothers, but the reconstruction of that line is disputed. Urnamu was Utuhigol's general before founding his own dynasty, but whether he was blood family, an adopted heir, or simply a powerful military commander who seized power remains unclear. After Urnamu came his son Shulgi, who ruled for 48 years, and left behind extensive royal inscriptions and hymns praising his wisdom, strength and divine favour. Shulgi was succeeded by Amar Swen, or Amar Sin, about whom we know very little. Then came Shuswen, or Shuwen, who may have been Amar Swen's son, or possibly his brother, or possibly his nephew. The evidence is contradictory. Finally, Ibisin became the last king of the dynasty. We have no idea who his father was. For a civilization that documented grain rations, this is absurd. Ur III kings commissioned monumental ziggurats, reformed legal codes, controlled vassal states, and declared themselves beloved of the gods. Yet their family tree is a blank. Why? The CD Lime Digital Library Initiative project, which has compiled the most comprehensive database of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, has an entire page dedicated to the Ur III royal family. The opening line reads, "Our failure to establish, beyond doubt, a genealogy for the royal family of the Ur-3 state remains puzzling after tens of thousands of administrative tablets, after decades of scholarly analysis, after cross-referencing seal inscriptions, royal hymns, and temple dedications. We still can't map the bloodline. The page goes on to note that several elite provincial families, the ruling clans of Umma, Nippur and Girsu, are very well documented. We can trace their genealogies across multiple generations. We know who married whom, which sons inherited which offices, how political alliances were formed through marriage. But for the royal family, the dynasty that ruled the entire empire, genealogical information is almost absent. Princes are referred to as son of the king without naming the king. Queens appear in economic texts, receiving offerings and managing estates, but their relationships to specific kings are ambiguous. Amar-Suen and Shu-Suen are never mentioned before they became kings, as if they materialized fully formed onto the throne. And Ibi-Sin, the final ruler, whose reign collapsed amid famine and Elamite invasions, has no verifiable ancestry at all. Why would a dynasty obsessed with legitimacy, one that claimed divine favour, built massive temples, reformed the calendar, and commissioned literary hymns celebrating their connection to the gods, obscure its own bloodline? One possibility, suggested by scholars, is that the Ur-3 kings practiced fraternal succession. Instead of passing the throne from father to son, they may have followed a pattern of seniority, where the oldest male member of the royal family inherited regardless of direct descent. This system is attested in some Mesopotamian contexts, and would explain why we don't see clear father-son transitions. If brothers, cousins and uncles all had potential claims based on age and ability rather than primogeniture, then documenting the family tree becomes less politically important. But that explanation only holds if the royal family was confident in its collective legitimacy. If they all descended from a common acknowledged ancestor, say Ur-Nammu, then seniority-based succession makes sense. Everyone agrees they belong to the same dynasty, so it doesn't matter precisely which brother or cousin takes the throne. But what if the royal family wasn't confident in their collective legitimacy? What if their ancestry was contested, or embarrassing, or inconvenient? What if Ur-Nammu himself didn't have a clear claim to kingship by traditional genealogical standards, and obscuring his origins was the simplest way to avoid uncomfortable questions? This scenario gains weight when we remember the political context. Ur-Nammu founded his dynasty after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, a period of chaos and fragmentation in Mesopotamia. Multiple city-states were vying for dominance. Utu-Higul of Uruk had briefly unified the region by defeating the Gutians, a foreign dynasty that had ruled after Agod's fall. But Utu-Higul's reign lasted only 7 years before Ur-Nammu, his general and possible brother, took power and shifted the capital to Ur. Coups, even successful ones, create legitimacy problems. If Ur-Nammu seized power rather than inheriting it legitimately, then his descendants would need to paper over that origin. They couldn't point to a long ancestral line stretching back to earlier dynasties because no such line existed, or because acknowledging it would reveal the seizure. So instead they emphasized divine favour, military success, administrative competence, and monumental building projects as proof of legitimacy, while quietly downplaying genealogy. And once genealogical obscurity becomes normalized in the dynasty's founding generation, it persists. Later kings inherit not just the throne, but the strategy of avoiding detailed ancestry claims. Better to keep the family tree vague than to open it to scrutiny. But there's another, stranger possibility. What if the Ur-3 kings deliberately obscured their ancestry because they were claiming a bloodline they couldn't prove? We know from other Mesopotamian rulers that fabricated genealogies were common. Kings regularly commissioned inscriptions tracing their descent from legendary heroes, Gilgamesh, Lugalbanda, even gods, to enhance their legitimacy. The Assyrian and Babylonian king lists, compiled centuries after the Year 3 period, retroactively inserted ancestors and divine lineages that almost certainly didn't exist. But inventing a genealogy requires confidence. You have to believe no one can credibly challenge your claim. If the Year 3 kings wanted to claim descent from an antediluvian bloodline, or from Ziusudra, or from some other prestigious ancestor, but they knew other families might dispute that claim, then the safest strategy is silence. Don't assert a specific ancestry, but don't deny it either. Let the ambiguity work in your favour. Rule so effectively that people stop asking where you came from. This would explain the pattern we see: meticulous documentation of everything except genealogy. The Year 3 state wanted to appear orderly, divinely sanctioned, and permanent, but documenting the royal bloodline would invite comparison, challenge, and potential falsification. So they documented everything else, creating an illusion of transparency while concealing the one detail that mattered most. And here's where it ties back to the Sumerian king list. The Well-Blundell Prism and other versions were compiled during or shortly after the Year 3 period. The scribes writing these texts lived in the same cultural milieu that was obscuring royal genealogies. They had access to the same archives, the same traditions, the same political pressures, and they made the same editorial choice: emphasize divine favour, downplay bloodline continuity, normalize genealogical gaps. The omission of Ziusudra from the king list isn't just about the distant past. It's about establishing a precedent for the present. If the antediluvian bloodline can be erased, if the most sacred genealogical connection in Sumerian history can be omitted from the official record, then any later genealogical obscurity becomes acceptable. The Year 3 kings don't need to explain their ancestry because the king list itself models a world where ancestry is secondary to divine appointment. Unless, of course, the Year 3 kings were descended from Ziusudra's line and were hiding that fact for opposite reasons. Not because their ancestry was weak, but because it was too strong enough to provoke rivals who might challenge or eliminate them if the connection were known. That possibility leads us into darker territory, the price of being remembered. Let's consider what happens to bloodlines that claim too much. In 2350 BC, a man named Sargon established the world's first empire, uniting the city-states of Sumer under Akkadian rule. His origins are famously obscure. Later legends claimed he was a foundling, discovered in a basket floating on the Euphrates, adopted by a gardener, and later chosen by the goddess Ishtar for greatness. His name, Sharukin, means the king is legitimate, a name that protests too much, as if legitimacy were the very thing in question. Sargon ruled for 56 years, conquering territories from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. His grandson, Naram-Sin, declared himself a god, stamping his inscriptions with the divine determinative and claiming the heavens had granted him direct authority. For over a century, the Akkadian Empire dominated Mesopotamia, projecting power and cultural influence across the ancient Near East. Then it collapsed. Around 2150 BC, the empire fragmented amid internal revolt, external invasion, and possibly climate-driven famine. The Guchans, a mountain people, swept into the region and established their own dynasty. Akkadian royal bloodlines, so recently godlike, disappeared from the record. Sargon's descendants were either killed, absorbed into other families, or reduced to powerless obscurity. The lesson was clear: claiming too much, especially claiming divine status or unbroken genealogical authority, makes you a target. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian history. Dynasties rise, declare themselves chosen by the gods, build monuments, commission king lists that emphasize their legitimacy, and then fall, often violently, to rivals who erase their inscriptions, deface their statues, and rewrite the official narrative to diminish or omit them. In this environment, bloodlines that wanted to survive had to be strategic. Open claims to kingship invited challenge, but quiet claims, custodianship of temples, management of scribal schools, preservation of religious knowledge could persist for centuries without provoking lethal rivalry. The me of kingship, the divine authority to rule, was dangerous to possess. But the me of wisdom or priesthood or scribal training, those could be inherited and transmitted without attracting the violence that consumed royal bloodlines. This brings us back to Ziusudra. If his descendants survived the flood and carried forward the antediluvian bloodline, they faced a choice: claim kingship openly and risk conflict with every post-flood dynasty, or step back, maintain authority in other domains, and let political kingship rotate among rival families while quietly preserving the knowledge and rituals that actually sustained civilization. The latter strategy explains several puzzling features of Mesopotamian culture. First, the prominence of scribal families. Scribal training was hereditary, sons followed fathers into the Aduba schools. These families weren't politically powerful, but they controlled literacy, mathematics, record-keeping, legal interpretation, and textual transmission. In a pre-modern society, that's enormous power, just not the kind that gets you killed in coups. Second, the persistence of priestly lineages. Certain temple offices were passed down within families for generations. The high priest Simin Sin of Uruk, for example, was typically chosen from a specific bloodline. These families didn't rule cities, but they controlled access to the gods, managed sacred property, and performed rituals essential to the cosmos's functioning. Again, power without the target. Third, the existence of wisdom literature, like the instructions of Shurupak, which circulated for over a millennium without any political sponsor. No king commissioned it. No dynasty claimed ownership. It simply existed, copied by scribes, taught in schools, preserved as foundational knowledge. If Ziusudra's bloodline maintained that text, if they were the custodians of antediluvian wisdom, they could do so anonymously without ever declaring their ancestry publicly. And fourth, the figure of the Apkallu, the 7 sages who Babylonian tradition claimed brought civilization to humanity before the flood. These sages are described as fish-like beings who emerged from the sea and taught the arts of kingship, temple building, divination, and writing. Later traditions named them Adapa, Uanin, and others. They're not gods, exactly, and not quite human. They're intermediaries, knowledge bearers, teachers. Scholars typically read the Apkallu as mythological symbols, personifications of cultural development or imports from Sumerian prehistory. But what if they represent something else? What if the Apkallu are cultural memories of specific bloodlines who survived catastrophic upheaval, possibly the flood, and reintroduced lost knowledge to later societies? If Ziusudra and his descendants functioned as Akalu-like figures in the post-flood world, teaching, advising, transmitting me, then the myths of fish beings emerging from the abyss to civilize humanity could be a distorted memory of that historical role. This interpretation reframes the genealogical gaps. They're not failures of memory, they're protective erasures. Bloodlines that maintained authority through knowledge rather than force had every reason to keep their ancestry obscure. Visibility meant vulnerability, so they embedded themselves in institutions, temples, schools, guilds, and transmitted their knowledge laterally through training and adoption rather than vertically through publicized bloodlines. And that strategy worked. While political dynasties rose and fell, scribal families, priestly lineages, and scholarly traditions persisted. The knowledge endured, the me were transmitted, civilization continued, but at a cost. The cost was memory. If a bloodline deliberately obscures itself to survive, then eventually even its own descendants forget who they are. The connection to Ziusudra, to the antediluvian kings, to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven, all of that fades into myth. The family that once carried the divine mandate becomes just another scribal house, just another priestly lineage, indistinguishable from dozens of others. And the king list, by omitting Ziusudra, accelerates that forgetting. It normalizes discontinuity. It teaches that genealogy doesn't matter as much as divine favor. It erases the very concept that a specific bloodline might have an unbroken claim stretching back before the flood. Which brings us to a final uncomfortable question. What if the erasure wasn't protective? What if it was hostile? What if later dynasties didn't just ignore Ziusudra's descendants? What if they actively suppressed them, ensuring no rival bloodline could ever challenge the new order? The mechanisms of forgetting. There are many ways to erase a bloodline without violence. You can exclude them from political office while allowing them to keep minor temple roles. You can prevent their sons from marrying into influential families, ensuring they remain peripheral. You can commission king lists and royal hymns that emphasize divine favor over genealogy, gradually shifting cultural values away from ancestry toward performative legitimacy, military victories, building projects, prosperity. You can flood scribal schools with students from rival families, diluting the influence of any single lineage. You can rewrite myths, attributing the deeds of one bloodline to another, or to gods directly, so the human agents disappear from cultural memory. And most effectively, you can do nothing. You can simply fail to document them. In a culture where written records confer reality, absence from the archives is a kind of death. If the three scribes who compiled administrative tablets, legal codes and temple receipts chose not to mention specific families, not to list their genealogies, not to record their property, not to acknowledge their temple offices, then within a few generations, those families cease to exist in historical memory, even if their descendants still walk the streets of Nippur or Ur. This isn't speculation. We know it happened. Consider the case of Abi-Simpti, a queen during the Ur-3 period. Economic tablets from the reign of Shu-Suin refer to her as Nin, the Sumerian term for queen or lady. She managed large estates, received offerings, and held significant authority. Yet we don't know with certainty whose wife she was. Scholars debate whether she was married to Shulgi or Amar-Suin. The evidence is contradictory. One seal inscription, copied during the Old Babylonian period, describes her as the wife of Amar-Suen, but another contemporary text calls her the mother of Shu-Suen, which would make her Amar-Suen's wife if Shu-Suen was Amar-Suen's son, or possibly Shulgi's wife if Shu-Suen was Shulgi's son. Confused? So are Assyriologists. This is a queen, a woman with economic power, political influence, and religious authority, and we can't place her in the family tree. If the wife of the king can be genealogically obscure, what chance did lesser families have? Or consider Ibbi-Sin, the last Ur-3 ruler. He reigned for 24 years, watching the empire collapse around him. Elamite invasions, Amorite incursions, provincial rebellions, famine, economic collapse, everything that could go wrong did. Eventually, Ibbi-Sin was captured, dragged off to Elam, and disappears from history. We have letters he wrote, desperate pleas to provincial governors who stopped obeying him. We have administrative texts documenting the final years of the regime. We have lamentations written after Ur's fall, mourning the destruction of the city, but we have no idea who his father was. No inscription names Ibbi-Sin as son of Shu-Suen, or son of Amar-Suen, or son of anyone. He appears on the throne without genealogical introduction, rules for 2 decades, and vanishes. Later king lists mention him, but only to mark the end of the dynasty. He is a closing parenthesis, not a person. Why would the last king of a dynasty, especially one that left behind tens of thousands of records, be genealogically invisible? One possibility, he was a usurper. Maybe when Shu-Suen died, the legitimate heir was too young, too weak, or unwilling to take the throne, so Ibbi-Sin, perhaps a general or provincial governor, seized power. That would explain why he's never called son of the king during Shu-Suen's reign. He wasn't. He was an outsider who became king by force or political manoeuvring, and later scribes, compiling the official record, chose not to highlight that fact, treating his reign as a continuation of the dynasty even though bloodline continuity had broken. But another possibility is simpler. By the time Ibbi-Sin took power, genealogy had become so obscured within the royal family that no one could credibly claim pure descent from Ur-Nammu. The dynasty had practiced fraternal succession, adopted heirs, married foreign princesses, and incorporated provincial elites for so long that the bloodline was hopelessly tangled. So Ibbi-Sin didn't claim ancestry. He claimed divine favour, administrative competence, and the support of the gods, standard royal rhetoric. And because the dynasty was collapsing, no one bothered to document the details. The bureaucracy was disintegrating. Scribes had more pressing concerns than genealogical records. And when Ur fell, when the dynasty ended, the gaps became permanent. Later scholars, looking back, couldn't reconstruct the family tree because the original records were either never made or never preserved. The genealogy of the Ur III kings, one of the most powerful dynasties in ancient history, simply ceased to exist. But here's the eerie part. This same pattern appears earlier, in the antediluvian section of the king list. Long reigns, obscure transitions, no clear genealogical links between kings, even when they ruled the same city. Alulim and Alulgar both ruled Eridu, but we're never told if Alulgar was Alulim's son, brother, or successor from a different family. The text just lists them sequentially, as if sequence equals legitimacy. It's the same structural silence, the same editorial choice to emphasize continuity of office while obscuring continuity of blood. And if that pattern was established in the mythological past, it became easier to replicate in the historical present. The Ur III scribes didn't have to justify genealogical obscurity because the king list they were copying already normalized it, which raises the darkest possibility. What if the Sumerian king list was never intended to be a complete genealogical record? What if it was always a political tool designed to legitimize whoever currently held power by presenting kingship as a divine institution that could descend from heaven multiple times, landing wherever the gods chose? In that case, the gaps aren't failures, they're features. They allow flexibility. They prevent any bloodline from claiming exclusive, eternal legitimacy. And Ziusudra, the one figure who should anchor the genealogy, the one survivor who should connect pre-flood and post-flood worlds, becomes the ultimate threat to that system. Because if Ziusudra's bloodline exists, if his descendants can be traced, if their claim to kingship is absolute, then the flexibility disappears. The gods can't choose whomever they want. They're bound by genealogy. Divine favour becomes hereditary again, locked into a single family, and every other dynasty is exposed as illegitimate. So Ziusudra has to disappear. Not murdered, not exiled, just omitted. Let him drift into myth, disconnected from the historical king list, remembered in flood stories and wisdom literature, but never integrated into the chain of kingship. Let his descendants, if they exist, remain nameless scribes, anonymous priests, obscure families managing minor temples in forgotten cities. Let the bloodline survive, perhaps, but never rule, and let the gaps in the record ensure that no one, centuries later, can prove otherwise. The scribes who kept silent. We need to talk about who compiled these texts and what they chose not to say. The Sumerian king list wasn't written by neutral historians. It was commissioned by royal courts, copied by scribal schools, and preserved in temple archives. Every version reflects the political priorities of its patron. The Weld Blundell Prism, for example, was likely written in Larsa during the early 2nd millennium BC. Larsa was competing with Isin for dominance over southern Mesopotamia at the time, and the king list we have ends with Isin dynasty kings subtly asserting Isin's legitimacy as the rightful heir to all previous Mesopotamian kingships. Other versions end differently. Some emphasize Kish, some emphasize Uruk. Some include dynasties that other versions omit. The Tumul Chronicle, a separate Sumerian text, focuses narrowly on the kings who rebuilt the Tumul sanctuary of the goddess Ninlil in Nippur, tracing a genealogy of temple builders rather than political rulers. Each version curates the past to serve present needs. But here's the fascinating detail. Despite all the variations, despite all the political tailoring, no version includes Ziusudra in the king list proper. That consensus is striking. Across centuries, across city-states, across competing dynasties, scribes agreed to keep him out. Why? The simplest explanation is that including him would raise questions no one wanted to answer. If Ziusudra survived the flood, if he was granted eternal life, if he carried the antediluvian bloodline forward, then what happened next? Did he rule? Did he abdicate? Did his descendants inherit kingship? Did they lose it? To whom? Under what circumstances? Any answer would be politically dangerous. If Ziusudra's descendants still existed and held power, including him in the king list would validate their claim, potentially at the expense of the reigning dynasty. But if his descendants existed and didn't hold power, including him would raise the question of why not, exposing past coups, usurpations, or suppressions that someone might want avenged. So the safest choice for every dynasty was omission. Let Ziusudra remain a mythological figure, known from flood stories, but disconnected from the political record. That way no one could trace their ancestry to him and demand the throne, and no one could accuse the current rulers of having stolen what rightfully belonged to his line. But scribes aren't passive. They make choices, and those choices leave traces. Consider the instructions of Shuruppak. This text explicitly names Ziusudra as the son of Ubaratutu and positions him as the heir to antediluvian wisdom. It was widely copied, taught in scribal schools for over a millennium, and exists in multiple versions from different cities and time periods. The scribes who preserved it knew Ziusudra's genealogical position. They copied his name. They taught it to students. They embedded it in the curriculum. And yet those same scribal schools also copied versions of the Sumerian king list that omitted Ziusudra from the royal sequence. This isn't forgetfulness. This is editorial policy. The scribes maintained two parallel traditions, one that preserved Ziusudra's genealogy in wisdom literature, and one that excluded it from political historiography. They kept the memory alive in one genre while suppressing it in another. Why would they do that? One answer: to preserve the truth without endangering themselves. Scribes were often caught between competing powers, kings who wanted propaganda, priests who wanted theological correctness, and their own professional obligation to preserve knowledge accurately. By embedding Ziusudra's genealogy in the instructions of Shuruppak, they ensured it wouldn't be completely lost. But by keeping it out of the king list, they avoided directly challenging royal authority. This strategy, hiding truth in plain sight by placing it in texts that seem peripheral or mythological, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. The Eridu Genesis, the flood narrative that names Ziusudra as the survivor, is framed as a creation myth, not a historical chronicle. The Atrahasis epic, which tells a similar story about Atrahasis, another name for the flood survivor, is a literary composition, not an official document. By keeping these stories in myth rather than history, scribes could preserve them without directly contradicting the king list. But there's a deeper layer. Scribes in ancient Mesopotamia weren't just bureaucrats. They were knowledge keepers, ritual specialists, and often members of hereditary professional families. Many scribal lineages maintained their offices for generations, passing literacy and textual knowledge from father to son. These families had their own histories, their own genealogies, their own sense of identity that existed alongside, and sometimes in tension with, the royal dynasties they served. What if some of these scribal families were Ziusudra's descendants? That possibility sounds speculative, but consider the circumstantial evidence. The instructions of Shurupak presents itself as knowledge transmitted through the bloodline of Ubaratutu to Ziusudra. It's explicitly genealogical, and it's preserved by scribes, whose profession is also genealogical, scribal training passed from fathers to sons within families who controlled literacy. If Ziusudra's descendants survived as a scribal lineage rather than a royal one, they would have the motive, the means, and the opportunity to preserve texts like the instructions of Shurupak, while simultaneously compiling king lists that omitted them from the political record. They could maintain their true genealogy privately, within the family, while publicly serving royal courts that had no connection to the antediluvian bloodline, and they could leave clues, subtle references, embedded genealogies in wisdom literature, patterns of omission in official texts that alert careful readers to what's missing. Not open challenges, that would be suicidal, but quiet acts of preservation, ensuring that someday someone reading carefully might notice the gaps and ask why they're there. This brings us to the ME again, the divine principles that govern existence. Among the ME listed in Sumerian texts are scribal art, writing and wisdom. These aren't generic skills, they're sacred functions, gifts from the gods, specifically from Enki and the goddess Nisaba, that enable civilization to persist. And they're transmitted through specific bloodlines, within families who guard the knowledge jealously. If the ME of kingship descended from heaven multiple times, subject to divine whim, but the ME of scribal wisdom remained within a continuous bloodline stretching back to the antediluvian period, then the scribes, not the kings, would be the true bearers of unbroken continuity. Kings could rise and fall, dynasties could collapse, cities could be destroyed, but as long as scribal families preserved writing, maintained archives, and trained the next generation, the thread of civilization held. In that context, omitting Ziusudra from the king list isn't an act of suppression by royal power against a rival bloodline. It's an act of humility, or perhaps camouflage, by the bloodline itself. We don't need to be listed as kings. We already have something more valuable. We have the knowledge. We have the ME of writing, wisdom and memory. Let the kings fight over thrones. We'll preserve the past and ensure it endures. But survival through obscurity has a cost. If a bloodline deliberately hides for generations, eventually its descendants forget the original reason. The knowledge persists, the professional identity persists, but the genealogical connection to Ziusudra, to Ubaratutu, to the antediluvian kings, that fades. The scribes continue copying the instructions of Shurupak, but they no longer remember that it's their family history. They teach it as ancient wisdom, not as ancestral testament. And the gaps in the king list, once protective silence, become permanent amnesia. What the tablets remember, what the blood forgot. Let's examine what happens when institutional memory outlives genealogical memory. By the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BC, Sumerian was no longer a spoken language. It had been replaced by Akkadian, a Semitic language, though Sumerian remained the language of scholarship, religion and literature, much like Latin in medieval Europe. Scribes trained for years to master Sumerian cuneiform, memorizing word lists, copying literary texts, and learning the grammar of a dead language. The instructions of Shurupak was still being copied during this period. Students in Eduba schools in Nippur and elsewhere practiced writing it out, line by line, as part of their training. They learnt the proverbs, the warnings, the advice that Shurupak gave to Ziusudra. They knew it was an ancient text, a relic from the distant past. But did they know whose past? Did they understand that the names in the text, Ubaratutu, Shurupak, Ziusudra, were the same names mentioned in the Sumerian king list and flood narratives? Some surely did. Advanced scholars, priests and senior scribes would have made the connections. They had access to multiple texts, cross-referenced them, and understood the broader literary corpus. But younger students, provincial scribes, or those trained in more practical disciplines, might have copied the instructions of Shurupak mechanically, without grasping its genealogical significance. And over time, as scribal families intermarried with others, as professional roles diversified, as some lineages died out and others rose to prominence, the specific knowledge, our ancestors were Zisudra's line, could easily be lost, even while the text itself survived. This is the paradox of written preservation. Writing extends memory far beyond any individual's lifetime. Texts can survive for millennia, pass from hand to hand, copied and recopied, outlasting the cultures that created them. But writing also separates memory from identity. A text can be preserved by people who have no personal connection to its origins, who copy it dutifully without understanding its deeper significance. The information persists, but the meaning, the lived, genealogical, familial meaning, vanishes. So it's entirely possible that by the time the Weld Blundell prism was inscribed around 1800 BC, the scribes copying the Sumerian king list no longer knew they were omitting Ziusudra as a protective measure. They were just copying an established template, following the conventions of the genre, preserving the structure handed down by their teachers. The original political reasons for the omission, avoiding legitimacy crises, protecting a hidden bloodline, normalizing genealogical flexibility, had been forgotten. The gap had become traditional, and tradition, once established, is self-perpetuating. But here's the eerie implication. If the scribes themselves forgot why Ziusudra was omitted, then the erasure succeeded completely. The bloodline, if it survived, lost even its own internal memory. Zisudra's descendants might still exist, working as scribes, serving in temples, teaching in schools, but they wouldn't know who they were. The connection to the antediluvian kings, to the pre-flood world, to the unbroken transmission of divine knowledge, would be severed not by violence, but by forgetting. And that raises a final unsettling question. How many other gaps in Mesopotamian records represent the same process? How many unnamed princes, undocumented queens, unrecorded priestly families, and genealogically obscure scholars were descendants of bloodlines that once held enormous authority but chose, or were forced, to fade into anonymity? How much of Mesopotamian civilization was actually sustained by hidden continuities that the official records deliberately omitted? We can't answer that with certainty, but we can look at the pattern. The third dynasty of royal genealogy obscure. The dynasty of Isin, which succeeded Uath III, genealogy contested. The first dynasty of Babylon, which eventually conquered Mesopotamia under Hammurabi, genealogy murky until Hammurabi himself, who then manufactured an ancestry connecting himself to earlier dynasties. The Kassites, who ruled Babylon for 4 centuries after 1600 BC, foreign origins, no clear genealogical records for most of the dynasty. Again and again, the bloodlines of rulers, the families who held political kingship, are either obscure, contested, or fabricated. But the bloodlines of scribes, priests, and temple administrators often are traceable, at least within local contexts. Families who managed the temple of Marduk in Babylon, who served as scribes in Uruk, who oversaw rituals in Sippar, these lineages can sometimes be traced across multiple generations because they documented themselves internally within professional archives without needing to broadcast their ancestry publicly. What if the real continuity in Mesopotamian civilization wasn't political? What if it was professional, priestly, scribal? What if kingship truly did descend from heaven repeatedly, landing on whichever strongman could seize and hold power, while the actual preservation of knowledge, ritual and cosmic order was maintained by families who never claimed the throne but never relinquished their hidden custodianship of the ME? In that reading, the Sumerian king list isn't a failure to document history. It's an accurate reflection of history's structure. Kingship was unstable, violent, and discontinuous, while the deeper institutions that sustained civilization were continuous, protected by obscurity, and genealogically rooted in bloodlines no one bothered to record because they never fought wars or built ziggurats. And Ziusudra, the missing link, represents the moment when those two forms of authority, political kingship and custodial knowledge-keeping, split apart. Before the flood, they were united in the antediluvian priest-kings. After the flood, they diverged. Kingship became contested, knowledge-keeping became hidden, and the gap in the king list marks that divergence. The silent inheritors. There's one more text we need to consider, and it's the strangest of all. In later Babylonian tradition, long after the Sumerian language had died and the cities of Sumer had fallen into ruin, scholars compiled lists of the Akalu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity. These texts, written in Akkadian during the first millennium BC, described the Apkallu as semi-divine beings, often depicted with the bodies of fish and the heads of men, who emerged from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean, to teach humanity the arts of kingship, temple building, divination, and writing. The first Apkallu, according to these lists, was Yu and also called Oannes in Greek sources, who served during the reign of Alulim, the first antediluvian king. The 7th and final Apkallu was Utu-Abzu, who served during the reign of Ubara-Tutu, the last antediluvian king, Ziusudra's father. After the flood, the tradition changes. No more fish-bodied Apkallu emerge from the sea. Instead, the list name human sages, often identified as scribes or scholars, who advised post-flood kings. These human sages don't have the same mythological aura as the pre-flood Apkallu, but they're still described as possessing extraordinary wisdom, often attributed to secret knowledge passed down from the antediluvian sages. Now here's the critical detail. The transition from divine Apkallu to human sages happens at the flood, and the mechanism of transmission, how the knowledge of the Apkallu survived the deluge, is never explained. The texts simply assert that post-flood sages inherited the wisdom. But from whom? How? The logical answer is Ziusudra. If he was the last antediluvian king, if Utu-Abzu the Apkallu served his father Ubara-Tutu, and if Ziusudra survived the flood, then Ziusudra would be the bridge. He would have learned from Utu-Abzu, carried that knowledge through the catastrophe, and transmitted it to the first post-flood sages, who then passed it down through their own lineages. But Ziusudra is never explicitly named in the Apkallu lists. The texts jump from the 7th pre-flood sage to the first post-flood sage without documenting the connection. It's the same structural gap we see in the Sumerian king list. Before the flood, detailed sequence, flood, after the flood, new sequence. No explanation of how one becomes the other. Why the persistent silence? One possibility is that the Apkallu tradition preserves a memory of Ziusudra's actual role, not as a king, but as a sage. If he functioned as a knowledge bearer and teacher rather than a political ruler, then his descendants would have been sages, scribes, and priests, the very lineages who preserved the Apkallu tradition. In that case, the omission of Ziusudra from the Apkallu lists mirrors the omission from the king list, but for a different reason. In the king list, he's omitted to avoid political complications. In the Apkallu lists, he's omitted to avoid revealing that the entire post-flood scribal tradition descends from a single bloodline. Because if that were known, if it were acknowledged that every scribe, every priest, every scholar in Mesopotamia ultimately traced their authority and knowledge back to Ziusudra and through him to the antediluvian Apkallu, then that bloodline would possess a form of legitimacy that transcended politics. They wouldn't need to rule. Their authority would be unchallengeable simply by virtue of genealogy. They would be the living vessels of the Emir of wisdom, and every king, no matter how powerful, would depend on them for cosmic validation. That's an uncomfortable amount of power to acknowledge. So instead, the tradition is genericized. The post-flood sages are presented as learned individuals chosen for their skill, not their bloodline. knowledge becomes meritocratic rather than hereditary. And the gap, Ziusudra's absence, prevents anyone from tracing a direct genealogical line from the present back to the antediluvian world. But here's where it gets even stranger. Some versions of the Apkallu tradition include a detail that's easy to overlook. The sages are described as having been hidden or taken away by the gods after the flood. The implication is that the Apkallu didn't die naturally. They were removed from the human world, either elevated to divine status or concealed in some otherworldly realm, leaving only their teachings behind. This motif, wise beings who are hidden rather than dead, appears across multiple Mesopotamian texts. Ziusudra himself is taken to Dilmun, a paradisiacal land where he lives eternally. The Apkallu are removed by the gods. Certain kings, in later legends, are said to have been hidden away rather than dying. It's as if Mesopotamian culture couldn't accept the idea that the bearers of ultimate knowledge simply ceased to exist. They had to go somewhere. They had to remain accessible, in theory, even if no one knew where they were. What if hidden is literal, not metaphysically hidden, but genealogically hidden? What if Ziusudra and his lineage were deliberately concealed within the structure of Mesopotamian society, serving essential functions, but never identifying themselves publicly? They would be taken away from the visible historical record, removed from king lists and public inscriptions, but still present, still active, still transmitting knowledge through institutions that didn't require open genealogical claims. In that case, the gaps aren't erasures, they're veils. The bloodline is still there, still operating, still fulfilling its original function as custodians of the ME, but it's veiled in professional roles, institutional identities, and generic titles, scribe, priest, sage, that obscure the deeper continuity. The kings change, the dynasties fall, the cities are conquered, but the scribes remain, copying texts, training students, preserving the knowledge, never announcing who they really are. And the texts they preserve, the Sumerian king list, the instructions of Shuruppak, the Eridu Genesis, the Apkallu lists, contain just enough information to allow someone, reading carefully across multiple genres, to reconstruct the pattern. Not enough to prove it conclusively, but enough to raise the question, enough to make you wonder what remains unspoken. We've traced the gaps, we've examined the omissions, we've explored the mechanisms by which a bloodline might be deliberately obscured or might obscure itself to survive. And we've seen the same pattern repeated across Mesopotamian history, genealogies that should be clear are murky, bloodlines that should be traceable vanish, and continuity is asserted structurally through institutions, texts, and offices rather than through named ancestors. What does all this mean? 3 interpretations coexist, and none can be definitively proven or disproven. The first interpretation is the mainstream scholarly view. The gaps are simply gaps. Ancient records were incomplete, damaged, or lost. Scribes worked with fragmentary sources, conflicting traditions, and imperfect memories. The Sumerian king list was never meant to be a precise genealogical document. It was a theological political narrative, emphasizing divine favour over ancestry. Ziusudra's omission is unremarkable. He belongs to myth, not history, and the text distinguishes between the two. The Ur-3 royal genealogy is obscure because fraternal succession made genealogical documentation less important. The Apkallu lists are late mythological constructions, not historical records. Everything can be explained by the natural limitations of ancient historiography. That interpretation is reasonable, defensible. It accounts for the evidence without requiring intentional suppression or hidden bloodlines. But it also requires us to believe that the Sumerians, who meticulously documented grain rations and livestock inventories, somehow couldn't manage to record their kings' family trees, that the scribes who copied the instructions of Shuruppak for over a millennium never noticed it, contradicted the king list genealogy, that the absence of Ziusudra from every version of the king list across multiple cities and centuries was pure coincidence. The second interpretation is that the gaps represent political manipulation. Royal dynasties, seeking to legitimize themselves without proving genealogical continuity, commissioned king lists that emphasized divine favor and normalized discontinuity. Omitting Ziusudra from the sequence allowed post-flood dynasties to claim legitimacy without competing against his bloodline. Obscuring the Ur-3 royal genealogy allowed later kings to avoid uncomfortable questions about usurpation or weak ancestry. The Apkallu lists were edited to prevent scribal families from asserting too much authority. In this reading, the gaps aren't failures, they're strategic omissions designed to serve the political needs of those in power. This interpretation is also reasonable. It aligns with what we know about how ancient rulers used texts to construct legitimacy. King lists, royal inscriptions, and historical chronicles were propaganda tools as much as historical records. Omissions, fabrications, and strategic silences are well documented in Mesopotamian sources, and if Ziusudra's bloodline posed a political threat, even a theoretical one, then systematically excluding it from official records would be the rational response. But there's a third interpretation, and it's the most unsettling. What if the gaps represent self-protection by the bloodline itself? What if Ziusudra's descendants survived, not as kings, but as custodians of knowledge, and deliberately maintained genealogical obscurity to avoid the violence that consumed every visible royal dynasty? In this reading, the omissions aren't imposed by royal power, they're chosen by the bloodline. The scribes who compiled the king list were themselves descended from Ziusudra, and they omitted their own ancestor to protect their continuity. The instructions of Shuruppak was preserved as a family text, passed down within the bloodline, but never publicly identified as such. The Apkallu tradition concealed the genealogical link because revealing it would have made the descendants targets. In this scenario, Ziusudra's bloodline didn't die out, didn't lose power, and wasn't suppressed. It transformed. It moved from political kingship to cultural custodianship, from visible rule to invisible preservation. And it succeeded. It survived for thousands of years, longer than any Mesopotamian dynasty, precisely because it learned to hide. And the gaps in the record aren't failures of memory. They're intentional silences, maintained generation after generation, protecting a continuity so essential that revealing it would have endangered the very civilization it sustained. Which interpretation is correct? We can't know. The evidence allows all three, and probably the truth involves elements of each. But the fact that we can ask the question, that the gaps are structured and consistent enough to suggest intention rather than accident, tells us something important about the nature of historical memory. Memory is not neutral, it's curated. Every text, every king list, every genealogy, every archive is a deliberate construction, shaped by the needs and fears of those who compile it. What we remember is a choice, but more importantly, what we choose not to remember is also a choice. And sometimes the absences speak louder than the presences. The Sumerian king list remembers 8 antediluvian kings. It remembers the flood. It remembers dozens of post-flood dynasties. But it doesn't remember Ziusudra, the one figure who should connect them all. That absence is not random, it's structural. And whether it represents suppression, self-protection, or something stranger, it reveals a truth about power. The most dangerous claims are genealogical, because political power can be seized, divine favour can be claimed, and economic dominance can be achieved, but bloodline, true, verifiable, unbroken bloodline, is either there or it isn't. You can't fake it forever. And if someone possesses it, and if that bloodline connects them to the origins of civilization itself, then their claim transcends politics, which is precisely why such a bloodline, if it existed, would need to be erased from the public record, or why it would choose to erase itself. The weight of lost names. Let's return to where we started, the Weld Blundell prism resting in its climate-controlled case at the Ashmolean Museum. It's a small object, 20 centimetres tall, 9 centimetres wide. You could hold it in your hands. 4 sides, 8 columns, hundreds of names pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. It claims to document every king who ever ruled Sumer, from the moment kingship descended from heaven until the early 2nd millennium BC. But it doesn't. It documents the kings someone wanted remembered. It preserves the genealogies someone wanted traced. And it omits the bloodline someone wanted forgotten, or the bloodline that wanted to be forgotten. Ziusudra is not on that prism. His name appears in other texts, in flood narratives and wisdom literature, but not in the official sequence of kings. The gap is there, permanent, pressed into the clay as firmly as the names that surround it. And that gap has survived for 4,000 years, copied and recopied by generation after generation of scribes who either didn't notice it, didn't care, or understood exactly what they were preserving. An absence can be an archive. Silence can be testimony. And sometimes the most important thing a text tells us is what it refuses to say. If Ziusudra's bloodline was erased, we've just traced the mechanisms of that erasure: political expediency, theological narrative, institutional continuity, prioritised over genealogical continuity, and the normalisation of gaps until they become invisible. If Ziusudra's bloodline erased itself, we've just traced the logic of that decision: survival through obscurity, authority maintained through knowledge rather than force, and the transformation from kingship to custodianship as a strategy for enduring across millennia. If Ziusudra's bloodline still exists, hidden within the professions that preserve memory, scribes, priests, scholars, archivists, then we've just traced the architecture of that concealment. And the gaps in the Sumerian king list aren't failures. They're the signature of a family that learned, long ago, that the only way to survive history is to step out of its spotlight. We can't prove which scenario is true. The evidence is gone, or hidden, or never existed in the form we'd need to settle the question definitively. But the question itself matters, because every civilization has bloodlines that claim authority, and every civilization has mechanisms for legitimizing or delegitimizing those claims. Mesopotamia chose a particular mechanism, emphasized divine favor, normalize genealogical discontinuity, and omit the inconvenient ancestors. And that mechanism worked so well for so long that we're still living in its shadow. We still structure legitimacy around performance rather than ancestry. We still treat genealogical claims with suspicion. We still write histories that emphasize institutions and ideas over bloodlines and families. We still, in subtle ways, replicate the editorial choices made by Sumerian scribes 4,000 years ago, which means the erasure, if it was an erasure, succeeded completely. Ziusudra's bloodline, whether it survived or perished, whether it ruled or hid, became irrelevant to how we understand the past. The kings whose names were preserved shaped history. The bloodline that was omitted disappeared from it. But disappearance is not the same as non-existence. Somewhere in the ruins of ancient Sumer, in the silt-covered remains of Nippur, Eridu and Shuruppak, there are tablets we haven't found yet, records we haven't translated, genealogies buried under 4,000 years of sand. And maybe, in one of those tablets, someone wrote the name that connects Ubaratutu to Ziusudra to the kings of Kish. Maybe the bloodline was documented after all, just not in the texts that survived, or in the archives that were excavated, or in the collections that made it to museums. Or maybe the absence is permanent. Maybe the erasure was so thorough, so deliberate, so carefully maintained across so many generations that no record exists because no record was ever meant to exist. Maybe the only evidence left is structural. The gap itself, the silence, the missing link, the name that should be there but isn't. And maybe that's enough. Because we notice the gap, we ask why it's there, we wonder what it conceals, and in wondering, we stumble closer to a truth that the Sumerian king list, for all its detail and precision, was never designed to reveal. That power is not always visible. That authority is not always documented. And that the bloodlines which shape civilizations are not always the ones history chooses to name. Where history ends and sleep begins. The museum is closing. The lights in the Ashmolean's Mesopotamian gallery dim. Security guards make their final rounds. And the well-Blundell prism remains in its case, exactly where it's been since 1923, its four sides still inscribed with the names of kings whose reigns ended thousands of years ago. Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Dumuzid, Ubaratutu, the flood swept over, Gor, Gulyanidaba Anapad, Palakinatim, Etana, Gilgamesh. The names march forward, dynasty after dynasty, city after city, kingship descending from heaven again and again, landing wherever the gods decreed, or wherever the strongest army stood, or wherever the cleverest scribes could craft a genealogy convincing enough to legitimize a new regime. And between the names, between the dynasties, between the flood and its aftermath, there are spaces, gaps, silences, places where a name should be but isn't, places where a bloodline should continue but doesn't, places where the record simply moves on, as if continuity were optional, as if genealogy were negotiable, as if the question of who had the right to rule could be answered by divine favour alone, without reference to the blood that carries authority from one generation to the next. Maybe those gaps are accidents, maybe they're political necessities, maybe they're protective silences, or maybe there's something more fundamental. Maybe they're acknowledgements of a truth that every civilization eventually confronts, that memory is fragile, that bloodlines fade, that even the most powerful families eventually lose track of who they are and where they came from, that the past, no matter how meticulously documented, always contains absences, and those absences, the names we've forgotten, the bloodlines we've lost, the connections we can no longer trace, might be more important than what we remember, because absence creates mystery, and mystery invites wonder, and wonder in the stillness of late night, when the world is quiet and the mind is free to drift, allows us to imagine possibilities that daylight logic would dismiss. What if the bloodline survived? What if, somewhere in the world, there are families who carry forward an unbroken lineage stretching back to Zusudra, to Ubaratutu, to the kings who ruled before the flood swept over? What if they know who they are, even if the rest of us don't? What if they still preserve the me of wisdom, still maintain the knowledge, still function as the silent custodians of civilization's deepest continuities? We can't prove it. We can't disprove it. The evidence is gone, or hidden, or was never recorded in the first place. But the gap remains. The question remains. And in that space between what we know and what we can only wonder about, history becomes something richer than facts and dates and lists of kings. It becomes a story about memory and forgetting, about power and obscurity, about bloodlines that claim too much, and bloodlines that hide too well. A story about how we choose what to remember and what to erase, and how those choices shape not just the past but the present, not just history but identity. The Sumerian king list, with all its detail and all its silences, is not a failure of documentation. It's a perfect reflection of how memory actually works. Selective, political, fragile, and shaped by the needs of those who preserve it. It remembers some things with obsessive precision and forgets others completely. It insists on continuity where none exists, and ignores continuity where it clearly should. And Zusudra, the missing link, the omitted heir, the bloodline erased from history, stands at the centre of that paradox, present in myth, absent from the record, remembered in stories, forgotten in genealogies, saved by the gods, lost to history. Unless he wasn't lost, unless the silence surrounding him is the most eloquent testimony of all, proof that some bloodlines are too important to be named, too powerful to be acknowledged, too essential to be made visible. In which case, the gaps in the Sumerian king list aren't errors. They're the structure that sustains civilization itself, the hidden architecture, the silent foundation, the bloodline that holds everything together precisely by refusing to claim the throne. And if you listen closely, in the stillness between one thought and the next, you can almost hear the echoes, the instructions of Shuruppak, whispered from father to son, the me of wisdom, transmitted through generations unnamed, the knowledge of the antediluvian world, preserved not in monuments or inscriptions, but in the quiet work of scribes who copied texts, taught students, and passed down a truth so deep it could only survive by remaining unsaid. That truth is simple. Bloodlines matter. Memory matters. Continuity matters. Not because they grant political power, but because they carry forward something older and more essential, the knowledge of who we are, where we came from, and what we were meant to preserve. And sometimes, the only way to preserve that knowledge is to erase the names, to hide the genealogy, to step out of history's bright, violent spotlight and continue the work in darkness, unnoticed and unnamed, for as long as civilization endures. The Sumerian king list tells us which kings ruled, but the gaps, the silences, the omissions, the missing names tell us which bloodlines survived. And perhaps, if you're very quiet, if you let your mind drift into the space between waking and sleep, you'll feel the presence of those bloodlines still moving through the world, not ruling, not claiming thrones, but preserving, teaching, remembering, carrying forward the me that descended from heaven before the flood, and holding them steady through every collapse, every conquest, every catastrophe, until the moment comes, if it ever comes, when the world is ready to hear their names again. Until then, the gaps remain, the silence holds, and the bloodline, whether forgotten or hidden, endures in the only way it can, by refusing to be written into the history that would destroy it. Sleep now. Let the names fade. Let the dynasties blur. Let the question of who ruled and who survived dissolve into the quiet rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Because in the end, what matters is not who claimed the throne, but who kept the knowledge. Not who was remembered, but who chose to be forgotten. And the Sumerian records, meticulous, political, silent, reveal the lost bloodline precisely by erasing it from human memory.